All right, let's talk about our case studies one on how in this specific case the suspect was placed behind a keyboard and multiple devices and such in a cyber stalking case. Now skip it to the case. Case I chose for this week is it's a case United States of America versus Ryan S. Lynn. It's a cyber stalking. There's a lot of other things in this case, child pornography possession, and a whole bunch of other things going on. And it's an FBI agent, Jeffrey Williams, who wrote this affidavit that we're going to go over this complaint. So in brief, the whole case is about Ryan Lynn was a roommate of Jennifer Smith. That's not her real name. Her real name was protected in the case. And they had a falling out, and Smith moved out, and Lynn began a reign of cyber harassment. Now, Lynn found the victim, Jennifer Smith, through Craigslist ad for a roommate, basically. So Lynn moved in, and that's when they had some falling out, and things really got pretty heated there. So we'll start at page 1 of the affidavit. We're going to skip the boilerplate, basically boilerplates for affidavits and for search warrants. If you haven't written any, basically just consists of who the person is and their background, brief background, and then a brief summary of the case. So we'll go skip it down to page 5, and this is kind of summarizing a little bit what happened, at least the start of how the suspect, Lynn, had potentially had access to everything that the victim possessed. For one, the victim had an Apple MacBook laptop, which she kept in her bedroom when they were sharing the apartment together. And the bedroom was not locked, and the laptop was not password protected. And worse still was there was a document that contained all the passwords to all the victim's online accounts. So you can imagine that that's a trove of serious data in the hands of someone with malicious intent. Now with that, when you're interviewing victims, one of the big questions to ask is who had access to a device, who had access to the data on the device. You can have physical access to the device, but who actually had access to password protection, for example, or was it password protected at all? Any shared online accounts such as iCloud, did anyone besides the victim have access? And also when you're questioning victims, the last thing to do is blame the victim, so don't ever blame the victim of, well, you should have locked your door, you should have put a password on your computer, because the victim's going to know that already. So at this point, you're just trying to get some cooperation so you can investigate the case, so let's not critique the victim at this point. We'll skip to page 7. We can easily see that Lynn has the capability of, doing computer anything. He has a majored in computer science. He has professional background in IT. So if you know who the suspect is, obviously, and in this case, it was pretty apparent who the suspect was from the beginning, from the outset, only because we'll go through the affidavit, but you'll see that basically Lynn was the suspect the whole time. So you can pretty much identify the suspect's background because you know who he is already. But in other cases, you may not know who the suspect is until after the fact. So this type of information wouldn't be until after you identify the suspect. So again, in this case, Lynn, the suspect, has opportunity and he has the ability. Opportunity because he lived in the same home as the victim, had access to the computer's password, no password protection, and the password document was on the computer as well. Okay, page 7, you can see that the suspect, Lynn, had texted the victim about her abortion, which was private and not shared. So that would be information that Lynn didn't have beforehand, and the only way to access that information would be from the laptop or the Google Drive account where she stored her personal journal. So if you didn't know who the suspect was to begin with, and there was a text that relayed some kind of personal information that only one person would know, or people who had access to the computer, this would narrow down your list of suspects. So again, just a reminder, you get to interview victims to potentially identify the suspect, whoever had access to the device. Again, on page 7, we're going to talk about her online journal. In this case, for instance, her online journal was printed out and thrown across the bedroom. And living with the suspect, Lynn, obviously he must have been the only person who did it. And of course he denied it. However, you're looking at physical access, and he physically printed, and he had some kind of hostility that he threw it across the bedroom. And of course the victim was upset enough to hit Lynn's computer, the suspect's computer, with a hammer. So now you have some confrontation, you have some motive, some incentive of the cyber harassment and where this is going. Okay, skip to page 8. We have some email spoofing, and this is where you'll email, the header or the return address is not, true. It's a faked spoofing email. In this case, the email was made to appear that the victim was sending it, but obviously it wasn't the victim. The email text also had excerpts of the victim's journal. Again, that goes back to who had access to this journal that no one supposedly had access to, and it comes down to a short list of people, I'm sure, Lynn being one of them. Interesting, you can see that Lynn, the suspect, included himself as a recipient in the email. And on top of that, he sent a reply to the email that he had sent that was spoofed to be sent from this victim. So you can look at this in different ways. One, suspects sometimes will try to insert themselves into their own case, whether it be as a victim or a witness, right? A spectator, for example, or perhaps so they can be inserted and they can continue the case or continue the harassment by being just a bystander. So don't discount bystanders in your case, because potentially one of the bystanders or witnesses could be your suspect. Now, as far as the spoofed email, Guerrilla Mail was named as an anonymous email that was used in this case, but it doesn't list anything about how the email was spoofed. Now, going to page 9, you can see Lynn, the suspect, didn't try to hide his identity trying to contact the victim. He was creating accounts in his name using his IP address, and he's trying to friend the victim multiple times. He wasn't trying to hide his ID, so that's kind of indicative of maybe he wasn't planning or anticipating the crimes he was going to commit later. So you can have early potential suspects with their real information, whether it be social media or whether it be emails, and they're not hidden. There's no attempt to hide it. They're not using VPNs or Tor or spoofed emails. They're actually using their real information. Now you can see this in other cases too, such as Russ Ulbricht with the Silk Road case. He was actually using his real Gmail account online in addition to his Dread Pirate Roberts email. So just don't discount things. If you actually see your suspect online, it doesn't mean that that person is not the same person who is doing the crime that you have not identified. Going to page 10, we can see that, again, the suspect is creating multiple accounts, and he's trying to friend the victim on these accounts. Again, he's not trying to hide his identity, which, it doesn't mean that he's not the cyber stalker. It just means that he probably wasn't intending potentially intending to commit crimes later, or unaware that he was, harassing the victim, illegally by doing this without hiding his identity. So again, don't discount early potential suspects as you think it could be, just because they blatantly show themselves and show their IP address. Okay, a side note on getting subscriber information, just what we've gone over so far, what you can see where, the IP address was, it was truly Lynn's IP address, and the email was spoofed, and I'm sure looking at the headers, it's not really as easy as I make it out to be. I'm just saying that we're trying to go through this a little bit faster so you know what the steps the investigator took. Subscriber information takes time, search warrants take time, because you need to gather cause, right? You have to write up. You can't just make a phone call to a judge and say, I need a search warrant for an address, or have your prosecutor magically create a search warrant. It all takes time to gather cause. You have to write it. It's like writing a short novel, and you have to go have it reviewed, sometimes by your administrator or your prosecutor, and then finally the judge. And you have time to wait, for the data after the service. So if you're, sending a search warrant to a ISP, you have to wait to get the data back. Then you got to sift through the data, and some of this can be controlled by you as far as the time goes. I've had cases where, in less than 30 minutes, I've had a search warrant approved telephonically on site. So in half an hour, I have a search warrant. Other times, it's taken me, weeks just to get cause to get a search warrant, and for the majority of the time, it takes me, it took me between an hour and a half to write a search warrant and get it approved by a local judge. So it all depends on the cause that you have and what you're trying to get, and how much effort it's going to take you to get that. Also, with search warrants and subpoenas and administrative requests, unless you have an active and ongoing investigation, which this was an active and ongoing investigation where the investigator is requesting data and applying for search warrants to search whether it be vehicles or the residence or ISPs. So this is ongoing investigating where you're getting real-time information on IP addresses, the email, and whatever DNRs on sent and received emails metadata. But also don't discount open source information, which basically is your social media and forums. This suspect, Len, he had a Twitter account, Instagram accounts. So even on an active investigation, you can still gather open source information while you're trying to gather evidence in your administrative subpoenas and court orders. All right, so skip to page 11. We can see here that Len had access to two of Smith's online accounts. We took a looking at the Google account and Smith's Apple iCloud account. To have access to it, obviously you need the password or to hack into it in some manner. Most likely in this case, since Lynn had access to her computer and a list of all her passwords, Lynn, the suspect, probably had access to everything directly with the passwords. Again, go back to who had access, and if you can find who had access, if you can get the login log, or the logs, access logs, IP address, a date time group of when and where her account or the victim's account was accessed, potentially you can identify the suspect that way. If Lynn had been accessing her iCloud account through a home IP address that wasn't hidden, not realizing that his IP address is being logged, that can lead you directly to your suspect. Okay, page 12, we got some spoofed email again. This spoofed email has been sent to 50 email addresses, all employees of the school district where the victim's father lives. And of course there is some pretty graphic information in the email that was sent. Now with spoofed emails, always check the email header. Some spoofed emails are not error proof. They're really cheap versions of a spoofed email, but there are some that will just change the return address where the entire header is intact with the original origin being correct and only the return address being changed. So it depends on how the emails were sent, whether or not they're really spoofed or if they're not spoofed that well. Some email spoof providers, and very few that I know of, will support law enforcement in that they actually keep records and perhaps the spoofing isn't as spoofed as they claim to be. So just keep in mind, when you have spoofed emails, you get to look at all of them. This one, there's one, but you can look at hundreds of emails. All it takes is one spoofed email to have some kind of error that can break open your case to all the other emails. Keep track of all the recipients later because you're going to need them for connections, and we'll talk about that shortly too. Also on page 12, again, I'm going to talk about usernames. Here's the first username in the affidavit, JSNMMA. So when you're coming across usernames, email accounts, you got to keep track of them because it's important in the case we want to identify the suspect, and you're going to have some user accounts and some usernames that are just unbreakable. You're not going to be able to identify who it is unless you have some sort of system. Okay, again, this is sending emails that are anonymous, for example, right? My point is try to break one of them. Try to break all of them, obviously, but if you can break one of the anonymous items, as long as you can tie it to the others, you will break all of them without much effort or breaking a sweat. So just a tip on that is organizing your data. You want to keep up on the data that you gather because it quickly overwhelms you in any case that has any type of technology in it. When you organize your data, you're going to find connections a lot faster, and it's going to help you not miss connections. And I'm talking about connections between evidence and connections between people and connections between evidence and people. So here's a simple example of a simple spreadsheet. Username, IP address, date, time, group, item, to and from. So this would be like a spreadsheet for emails. So you can design the table however you like it. Excel is great, obviously. You can put whatever columns you have in your case, third-party ISP providers, connections between accounts, associates, whatever you want to put in it where you're trying to look for connections. A spreadsheet is a bare bones way to do that. That's fairly simple and inexpensive. So let's say you add hundreds of usernames or emails and their associated IP address. And obviously if you have some Tor nodes, or if you have some Gorilla Mail, or you have something that you can't get the actual IP address, those IP addresses aren't going to be worthwhile, obviously. But sometimes you'll find real IP addresses. It could be the library, it could be Starbucks, it could be a home address, it could be a work IP address. So by doing that, you can quickly see that, for example, these two user accounts, Hella Mud has IP address number 2, whichever number 2 was, and it looks like Here I Am used the same IP address of IP number 2. So this practically ties those two user accounts together. So if you had multiple email accounts sending emails to your victim or victims, if you have a matching IP address, then you just tied at least 2 or more of those usernames together. I'm looking at a spreadsheet like this where we have, let's say, usernames or email accounts, and we have a string of IP addresses, and I just named them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. And you can simply put, let's take another example of using a spreadsheet for organization. This one's going to be usernames or email accounts associated with IP addresses. And simply, if you just have a username and you can put an X, where it matches the IP address. And this, again, this is a simple sheet, but if you have hundreds of emails, different user accounts, and hundreds of IP addresses, this is an easy way where you can actually sort through and see who's connected. And in this easy case, you can see that IP address number 2 was used by both Hella Mud and There I Go. So, you can assume that it's the same IP address, probably the same person, using 2 accounts. And you can even go a little bit further. You can see that There I Go use IP address number 5, which is also used by Where Are You username. So in this quick manner, we just saw that 3 accounts are probably related to the same person. So we didn't have to break every single one of them, but using it as a whole and looking at it overall, as long as you can break one, you can tie it to another and tie it to another. And again, there's many cases that are done this way where you have really solid encryption and really solid ID privacy of one suspect who doesn't use as strong privacy or makes an error in another account, but you can tie them both together. So you can bypass the world's strongest encryption by the weakest link in the chain, which could be most likely going to be the suspect's mistake or overlooking something they didn't think of was very important. All right, let's get to page 13. Now we're going to have some more privately accessed data from the journal, again, from the laptop or the iCloud or the Google account, and these text messages are all excerpts of that data. So you're looking at, again, who had access to that data, and narrow down your list of suspects. Again, more text messages and more text messages. So with this, when you have text messaging, obviously you have other avenues to research and investigate. You have whether it be sent online through a text messaging provider or sent through an actual phone, a cell phone, whether it be a burner phone, a prepaid phone, or someone's real personal phone account. So each one of those are going to require investigation. Every text message, what's the source of the message? Is there any data, metadata that can use to tie this back to a person or a place? So again, you're trying to look at all of these to try to break one of them, because if you can break one, obviously you can try to tie that to others and potentially break them all. Okay, well, page 14, we have some bomb threats, threats to shoot up some schools, and these are all determined to be hoaxes. And the connections to these bomb threats, for example, you have to look at how are they connected to your victim. In this case, you have one of the hoax made to appear from the Facebook page of Smith, the victim's former boss. And then you have, threats made to appear from, the father, and threats that bombs are in the victim's home and those sort of things. So they're all seem to be tied to the victim, because that's the purpose of this cyber stalking. The suspect is trying to harass and torment the victim. So everything connected to the victim that's going to harass and torment the victim is going to be connected in some fashion. Let's talk about connections. We use the same format. We have names to see how people are connected, and we can simply put an X to show a connection. Here you can have John and Bill are connected somehow. Now this may be through a common IP address, or through emails, or through a phone call, a workplace, or relationship. So you can easily see the connection. John has no connection to Mary, Jane, or Susan, but he only has a connection to Bill. Now you do this to all the people in your case, the victims, suspects, witnesses, and then you can easily kind of put them together and see that it looks like Mary is connected to everybody. She's connected to John, Bill, Jane, and Susan. Now that doesn't mean that Mary's guilty of anything if she's the suspect, but it does mean that if things are happening to Mary, these are potentially people who are connected. Or if the things would happen to those people that Mary is connected to. It just narrows down who is connected to who. If you look at Jane and Bill, for example, there's no connection whatsoever. If there's no relationships, if there's no electronic communications, nothing at all, then you're not going to have any reason really to delve into that background between those two. Now with Mary, you can look at this and say, well, Mary is connected to everybody and everything, so therefore it's a strong part of the case, most likely. You also don't need expensive software to do this when a spreadsheet can do it. There is some great software, i2 Notebook, even Microsoft Access does a great job as well if you're good at putting together databases. But if it's a manageable case, manageable size, you can easily do 100 accounts, hundreds of users in a spreadsheet, and you can manually go through it and find the connections. Let's go to page 15. Again, we have an escalation of child pornography sent via email and text. Now again, every email and every text is another piece of evidence to go through, and we're flying through this affidavit like it's happening, in an episode of 24, right? Or a CSI where, forensics is done in 15 seconds and they get everything. In reality, when you have an email, that's a lot of work. When you have a new email in your case, you have to look, and you're looking at it individually. You have to look at the sender, the origin, the IP address, the service provider, the email header. I mean, everything, the content of the email, and you're doing that for every single one of them. So it does take time, but each one of them, or any one of them, could be the break in the case if there is an error in there that leads to your suspect. Again, these are sent to the victim's friends and family. Going back to the connections, when you're seeing these things happen to connected people to your victim, although the victim is connected to these victims, they're both connected to the suspect. So that is your connection circle right there. And again, friends and family are typically victimized in an attempt to further victimize the victim. As far as the evidence goes, again, I'll say it again, every email, every text message is another opportunity to get more metadata, more content, and more evidence to pin identity onto a suspect. Okay, so again, a side note, Lynn was easily the primary suspect, and most likely the only suspect, unless he had conspirators that were helping him send emails or spoof emails. In many cases, there isn't a suspect that's identified, right? But in all the cases, you still have to tie the suspect to a device or devices and each activity. If you have 100 emails, the goal is to tie 100 emails to that suspect, if that suspect did 100 emails, obviously. The work's going to be the same whether you have an identified suspect or not. You're still chasing the metadata, you're still chasing IP addresses, you're still chasing records, you're still doing basic gumshoe work of trying to put a case together. Now, if you have identified suspect, it makes it a little bit easier to do more work. For example, you can do physical surveillance on your suspect. You can do a background investigation on your suspect. You can do a lot of things on your suspect that you have identified already, but the other work's going to be the same. Okay, let's hop to page 16. This is where we have a reinstalled OS. So the suspect, Lynn, in his previous job, he had left, and the operating system on the laptop he used was reinstalled. However, forensics, you can't beat it, right? You have a couple web browsing artifacts and bomb threats. You had this text now remnants that were found, and that's important because Lynn was using that service for some of the harassment, the text now harassment. Pure VPN artifacts. You had Lynn's name in Proton Mail, which is an encrypted mail provider, which just gives you more of what was going on with Lynn, what services he was using, which gives you more hints on how to deal with your investigation. He also had this rover.com website, which plays into this case as well, and there's FetLife. These were being used in the cyber stalking against the victim. You also see some other things they found, Spotify profiles. You're looking at the profile information was for Jennifer Smith, the victim, Joseph Smith, the brother, Ashley Jones, who's the victim's best friend. So on his work computer, he had the names or artifacts of the names of the victims and the victim's friends. So when you can't get the suspect's personal computer, the work computer is the next best thing. It's easier to get legal authority because it's owned by the business, and it's going to typically hold more information and evidence than a suspect realizes, because many suspects don't think that the police are going to come to their work and grab the computer that they worked on, specifically if they reinstalled an OS on it or thought that the laptop or desktop was disposed of. So this exam uncovered a lot of usernames, ISPs, VPNs, and such, which really benefits the case. So don't overlook prior computers that the suspect may have used. Now, on some cases, the clients might not want you to examine machines at perceived low value. So, if your boss, if you're working in law enforcement, your boss says, why focus on the work computer? The suspect has already been reinstalled. It's been 6 months. Follow your instinct. If you think there's something good on it, try to find out and see if you can see what you can find on it, because you never know what you're going to find without taking a look at it. One of the really neat things in that work exam was the real email account of Lynn. Now, if they didn't have this before, which they actually did have his personal email account from the beginning of the case, but if you didn't have it in the beginning of the case, you can get his actual email account from here. And obviously, in the full placing a suspect kind of keyboard case, I go over what you can do with the email account, what you can do with a phone number. But when you have an email account, the world is your oyster on what you can gather on a suspect, which means logged access, IP addresses, recovery email addresses, everything. Sometimes you can get phone numbers, real names, addresses, physical addresses. You can get a lot of information from a personal email account. As long as you have that email account, then you have legal authority to request it. So when I harp on it again, keep track of usernames, email addresses, and so forth, because it quickly can be it can be overwhelming on the first day of a case. You can seriously have 50 different usernames with hundreds of IP addresses, but you have to keep organized from the beginning. Otherwise, you're going to be overwhelmed, because they are all connected. If they're all part of your case and your suspect is creating all this data, they're all connected somehow. You just have to find the connections. Many of the connections you're not going to be able to find. You're just simply not going to be able to find a spoofed email sent from a Tor exit node. It's hard to find that connection other than looking at the content of the email. It may be something private and personal, only known to the suspect and the victim, and that can tie it, or perhaps it may be something else. The username account may be connected in some fashion. But your goal is to break just one of them. Just 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000, because if you can break one of them, all you need to do is start tying that one to another, and eventually you can break it all open and to tie them all together. So these data sources obviously going to be confusing, and a haystack of data, a needle in a haystack of needles, is what it can be from the start or by midway of the case. So just keep in mind, search, filter, sort, export. So when you have so much data, figure out your system now. Start with some spreadsheets, do some practice on some cases that you currently have or had. Look at the tools that you can use to put this data together. For example, email addresses. If you have an image and you want all email addresses, bulk extractor is great for something like that. Or a suite that can pull out email addresses or IP addresses, using grep is great. Whether it be Ncase or Xways or FTK or whichever tool of your choice, use those tools to pull out the data so you can import it into some sort of database or spreadsheet and then find the connections. So you want to structure the data. We're talking a lot of data. Structure it so you can look at it and see the connections. It takes a lot of time, but if you can imagine spending hours or days putting together one spreadsheet of massive amount of data, and it takes you maybe 5 minutes to find the one connection that breaks the case. It's not like you wasted a day or days to put together the spreadsheet to find 5 minutes of work. It's that much effort to put in to find the gold nugget to connect these pieces together. Let's go to page 18. Here we have some slip-ups. Slip-ups are normally called breaks in the case. That's what the media likes to call it, and that's what some investigators like to say. I've had a break in the case. I've always found that a break in the case is when the suspect just screws up massively. Whether it be the suspect knew that he screwed up or didn't know, it doesn't matter, they screwed up. So in this case, Len, the suspect, he had emailed himself 2 screenshots of his iPhone, right? And the screenshots showed the apps that were installed on his iPhone. You have an anonymous texting, encrypted email, and free burner telephone numbers. So obviously in this case, you'd have to have access to Len's Google account, which, once, in this case, the agents had his email address, knew he was a suspect, had cause, and had access to the records of his Gmail account. But that's the information that they got, and what a slip up you have there, right? He also openly discussed, openly as in publicly, on Twitter, how to use anonymizing services, what he thought of anonymizing services, specifically with VPNs. So you're having some information of his knowledge and intent of VPN and anonymizing services, and his Twitter handle. You have a Twitter handle of Ryan Lind Dev, right? Also, because of this, the Gmail account, what you have is the iPhone, right? So we know he has an iPhone. He could have had any cell phone, smartphone device in the world, but now we narrowed it down to iPhone. We know he has an iPhone. We know at least he had an iPhone at the time and he was using it with those apps. So that's what we're going to be targeting on. We're going to be targeting for an iPhone. We're going to be ready for an iPhone. We're going to be prepared for an iPhone in the beginning of the case, because eventually our goal is to grab that iPhone and examine it. So again, this is his slip up where he's tying his Gmail account to his iPhone and the iPhone to anonymous apps on his phone, and stating his knowledge of privacy services, and he named some VPNs, and there's a Twitter account. So that's a lot of things that were not tied together, but you can quickly tie them together. Let's go to page 20. If you remember in the beginning, I think we talked about the Rover Pet Service was some artifact found on his work computer. Well, the reason that was on his work computer is because the victim used Rover Pet Service. And from what I understand, it's kind of like an Uber for pets, where you put your information online and you can house sit pets for people, right? So the suspect Lynn knew that the victim used Rover Pet Service, which is important to know, because Lynn was trying to contact the victim through fake accounts on this Rover service. Now the victim assumed that these were fake accounts, and he must have been, maybe even the victim thought that these were from Lynn, but basically they were fake and she didn't respond to them. But then again, eventually he did get through. So he did connect with her with a fake account, and subsequently, uncovering that account's, subscriber information, comes back that Rover account was used with the personal email address of the suspect. So the suspect created a Rover account using his real email to create an account to harass the victim. So that's either a complete oversight, or doesn't care, or doesn't even know. The other thing he did was he used his profile name as Ashley being the victim's best friend's name. Now that may not be meaningless at all. I mean, it may be meaningful, who knows? But in this case, when you have the best friend as Ashley, and it's been noted before in the case, and Ashley's been somehow connected, earlier, then that's pretty obvious that most likely it's going to be your suspect. So he made it easy by using his real email address. And again, that's because of either complacency or laziness or even impatience, because creating fake email addresses, it's not that quick to do sometimes, unless you have a really spoofing email service where you're not looking to get return emails, and the providers don't really care. It's getting rarer and rarer that is the case. If you're trying to create legitimate accounts through whether it be Uber or Rover, they may not accept these anonymous email accounts. So again, keep track of the email addresses. Okay, again, with that email account or that Rover account, the victim didn't know that it was fake. She didn't know that it was the suspect that had contacted her. And then through that contact, there was a message sent, and the victim called the number provided by the suspect's account, thinking it was legitimate, and by doing so, the suspect got the victim's actual phone number. So this is a case of social engineering that worked out very well. And you can see as soon as Lynn got her phone number, quickly right after, he started sending harassing text messages. And you can imagine that the connection is pretty easy to see that, I got this account, and right away I started getting harassing text messages. Has to be from Lynn. The only way he got my number would have been him being that account that contacted me. Again, I want to say that even though you know who it is, the suspect, you still got to prove it. So we know that it's Lynn this entire time, but even though in our heart we know that it's Lynn, we still had to prove it. And that's what all this work is doing, where you're verifying and validating, corroborating information and data. So let's hit page 22. Let's go back to the IP addresses. keep track of them, because we're trying to find the connections to uncover a known suspect and tie it to the unknown. Now, this is a great part of the affidavit. I mean, this is just amazingly well written, and I enjoyed looking at it and going through it. So if you have, for example, this email address, which is the real email address, uncovered from the work computer, the victim already had it as well, and you have information on the IP address where it was accessed from, and also have the WAN security, the VPN service that was used with that Gmail address. So that's good information to have to begin with. So those two are tied together, the IP address and the email address. Now, if you look the next one here, same date, you have this email address, teleportxf@gmail. It's using the same IP address as the personal email address. So now you just kind of tied this teleport together. A few days later, you have Ashley Plano. This is that fake Rover account, and that one was created using the suspect's real email address. So now you tied this fake Rover account to the suspect's real email address. Did it again, logged in again and again and again. So the point is, the suspect made a mistake, led to another mistake, and they all were tied together. Now, in creating fake or realistic looking fake accounts, it takes a lot of time and effort. And again, like I mentioned, verification of accounts. Sometimes when you want to create an email account, it requires a phone number that can receive a text or a phone call, and to verify you're a person and not a bot. And you can do that once or twice, and maybe if you're doing like 50 or 10 or 100 fake email addresses, that gets kind of monotonous to a criminal, and that's where laziness and complacency comes in. It's like, well, I'll use the same number, I'll use the same email that I'm using for the last one, and without realizing that all it is a chain, and you find that weak link and you can break the whole chain. Also, each account creation involves IP address, whether it's anonymous or not. And by that I mean when someone's creating an account and they're going to the library and using the public Wi-Fi, or going to a cafe and using the the private Wi-Fi, publicly accessible private Wi-Fi. There's always going to be an IP address. Even Tor nodes are going to have IP addresses. So keep track of the IP addresses, because even though someone uses Tor, through the entire case before they're caught and arrested, all it takes is that one time they use their home IP address that will break all the hundreds of times they did it correctly. So the more accounts they need, to be completely anonymous, is more than the patience that pretty much anybody has. Typically, if a criminal wants to get away with something, they're going to have to do it one time, do it completely correct, and never do it again. And the serial harassers or serial criminals, they have to repeat what they're doing over and over again, because it's in the nature of the crime to be repetitive. And that's how you catch criminals, because through repetition, you're going to find some mistakes. I can say you can bank on it. Let's go to page 23. The complaint doesn't say how this was compromised, right, the Rover account, but I would say because the suspect most likely had her whole password list, commonly used passwords, or maybe she didn't change her password, and maybe they were close enough that he could potentially guess, which I don't usually believe that's that reasonable, but basically he probably had access to her account. And more, even potentially he could have put keylogger on her laptop or any kind of monitoring software and watch what she was typing on her computer at any given time. And again, he was emailing Smith's journal, or excerpts of Smith's journal. So to email excerpts of it, that person would have to have access to it at one point or another. And obviously Lynn is the person who had access to it. Whether we assumed he had access because her room was unlocked, and then we had physical proof basically because it was all printed out and thrown across the bedroom. So he had access to it, and in this case he's emailing pornographic images to pet owners, basically through the victim's account. Okay, at page 23, you also have, again, complacency using the same services as his good accounts and bad accounts. So again, it doesn't mean, I use Gmail, right? So just because I use Gmail, and some bad person uses Gmail, that doesn't mean that we're the same person. However, when you have a lot of the same accounts, right, and unique types of accounts, TextNow, Rover, and Gmail and WAN security, you've had all the similar, not widely world used accounts, and potentially you're looking at a more narrow narrow bucket of who the suspect could be. Here you have a fake account where he created account to get public records, basically, from trying to find out social engineering about who is he being investigated by. I would go to page 24. Okay, this is again circumstantial evidence, because we have, and I say circumstantial because on his workplace computer there is evidence of a TextNow account, and I can assume that since the computer had the OS reinstalled, it was very little bit remnants of TextNow, maybe some URLs perhaps. So not enough, because there's not an account under his name, for example. But that doesn't mean that it's irrelevant. It doesn't mean that it's not important to the case. It just means that it's a circumstantial evidence that he had a TextNow account or a TextNow artifacts remaining on his computer, and TextNow was one of the providers used in the cyber stalking case. So when you put them all together, it's circumstantial evidence is more than enough that you need for a case. I mean, almost every case is circumstantial evidence anyway. It's just that when you pile on so much circumstantial evidence, the judge and jury will look at it no other way than saying there's no way that the suspect did not do it based on all this circumstantial evidence. Some direct evidence, but mostly circumstantial is going to be what you're looking for. So don't devalue what circumstantial evidence is for your case, because the more you have, the better it's going to bolster your case. Okay, page 24. Past behavior. We talked about this before, where if you know who the suspect is and you know their past behavior, obviously, like they say, past behavior is a good indicator of future behavior, but also shows the suspect's ability. So if a suspect has been doing a specific thing before in the past, such as hacking into a Facebook account or creating fake Facebook user accounts to harass people, then they know how to do it. They can do it again. So at some point, as soon as you can identify the suspect, or even a short list of suspects, start backgrounding the short list of suspects. You can potentially, rule out some suspects based on, maybe some absolutely could not do it because they have no ability, capability, or motive based on your background of that suspect. Skipping to page 25, we have other cases that happen. These are unrelated to the victim, and I say unrelated because they're not directly targeting the victim or the victim's friends, but they're related because it's the suspect, Lynn, who had done this to other students and other victims. So when you have that suspect being named in other cases, it's related to your case because the activity is the same to your victim as it was to other victims in other cases. So find out whatever you can about your suspects. In this case, Lynn, the suspect, had orders against him, anti-harassment, I believe, or cease and desist orders against him in the past. So if someone has anti-harassment, no contact orders, restraining orders in the past, and you can see that and find that, then you can likely assume that that person's behavior is always being the recipient of these orders. So if they've had them in the past, that is a good indicator of what's happening now in your victim's case as being a good potential for a suspect. So the hard stuff in this case were the VPNs, obviously. And I say VPNs because a VPN is typically pretty good about protecting your identity and what you're doing on the internet. But in this particular case, the VPNs gave away the access logs. So it didn't really work that good for the suspect, but it still takes time and effort to grab. Tor was used, Proton Mail, Gorilla Mail, some burner phone numbers, and a lot of online things such as online texting, online burner phone numbers, that sort of thing. So again, the good stuff I mentioned was the pure VPN and WAN security. They keep logs of activity. So Len, the suspect, was using these services, either realizing or not caring or not believing or anticipating these IP addresses being uncovered in the investigation. Regardless of what he was thinking, regardless if he thought that he was protected because nothing was being logged, or regardless if he thought nobody would ever find out or take the effort to get him, the result's the same. When you come across a pure VPN or any ISP, and the ISP says we don't keep anything, or that's past our retention period, or that's we don't keep, ask anyway to check. If you can send a subpoena or a warrant and say, well, look again, tell me what you have, you might be surprised what you find out that they have, because they may have data, and I've seen this on many occasions where they may have a 6-month retention, but they may keep it for a year and a half or 2 years just because they forgot, or just because they say one thing but what they're actually doing is something different. So if you don't ask, you will never know. So this case had a lot going on in it. I picked it for the first one as a case review because it had a lot going on with it. Other case reviews I'm going to do, potentially if this seems to be something that's worthwhile that you want to see as a regular basis, I'll probably do 2 or 3 case studies within the same time frame of about an hour, because other case studies are probably going to be a little bit shorter just because of they're not going to have this much going on with it. Lynn did a lot. I mean, we're talking so many crimes in here. Pornography, distribution, harassment, hacking, unauthorized computer access. I mean, just on and on and on. So this one actually had a lot of stuff to get through. The paper you need to get this type of evidence, and this is a criminal case, obviously. And when I say you need paper to get this kind of evidence, you need whatever jurisdiction that you're working under, you're going to need paper to demand or request the data, whether it be administrative orders or court orders or magistrate orders or whatever you need to get, or memos or whatever you need to get approval to get subscriber information takes time, or to get search warrants written and approved takes a lot of time. If you're doing civil cases, you can easily come across this type of case on any basis, right? I've had several civil cases turn criminal, within minutes of a certain thing happening, or a certain data that I find, or a certain phone call from a client saying, well, this just happened, and my response is, well, now it's a criminal case. So we had to look at it as a criminal case. We need to get law enforcement involved because there's a threat of harm and personal risk, that sort of thing. So even civil cases can turn criminal very quick. So if you're doing a civil case, and let's say the client does not want it to be criminal, let's say it's an internal corporate matter, still consider grabbing the evidence as if it's going to be used as a criminal case, because in any civil case, even in a case where a civil client may want to keep it private and internal and not go into a prosecution or a criminal investigation, there will be times where that option is not going to be available. If someone gets hurt or the threat of harm is substantial and real, no matter what somebody wants, the victim is going to have to be protected in some manner. So just keep in mind, civil cases can turn criminal pretty quick. The other thing on anonymous accounts is the more the merrier, the more the better. The more anonymous accounts you can identify, the better chance you're going to have of breaking just one of them. Because all you need to do is break one, because if you can break one and show just the loosest tie to another, you might be able to find the most concrete ties to all of them. So just be aware that, don't be upset like, oh my gosh, another spoofed email or another IP address, a Tor exit node in Europe or a Tor exit node in Australia. Each one of them it's a potential diamond in the rough. So just keep it in mind. The other point I get across is your case is like a novel. Your affidavit and report should read like a novel. Basically, it's consecutive. It's written in a manner that this happened first and this happened next and this is what I did. When something is missing, in your mind you have to think, why is this missing? Because it's something either I missed, or it's something the suspect is hiding from me, and how do I find it? So that concludes this first case study is one. I hope that it was something that was beneficial to you, and please take the quick quiz. And if you take the quiz and you pass it, you have an email shortly, a few minutes or however long it takes for it to be generated, but you have a certificate that's going to state 1 hour of documented training for this case studies. Also, I do have a survey monkey. I hope it works out well. Please take it's like 7 or 8 questions, whatever it is, quick questions. Let me know if you like this or if you didn't like it, or if this can be something that you would like to see more of, and if so, anything you would suggest to change. Now, if it's not something that you want to see, then I probably won't do this anymore. So I do case reviews on my own all the time. If I find a good case, I look at it and I do it on my own. I read it myself, I figure it out myself, or I print it out, I make notes on it, and I try to get ideas of, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Oh, I never thought of that before. Or, oh, I tried that before, that works really well. And I do that myself. And I like watching case studies when I can find them, but you don't really find them that often. So if this is something that you like that's beneficial, definitely let me know in the survey, because if not, I'll keep doing them by myself. But if it's something that you believe it's really beneficial, then I'd be glad to keep doing these from everybody. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.